Hello, welcome, dear students, dear colleagues, and dear members of the interested public. First of all, a caveat, please note that we are recording this event and that we will also do some screenshots right about now, maybe. And so if you don't want to be seen, please turn your camera off and keep it off. We, that is American Studies Würzburg, and I'm very happy to welcome here the Chair of American Studies, Katrin Gersdorf, and Professor of American Cultural Studies, Mary Ann Snyder-Körber, and the former Chair of American Studies, Jochen Achilles, and Irish Studies Würzburg, Professor Maria Eisenman, and me, and all the other members of the team. All of us, we are very delighted today to welcome a distinguished guest, Professor Philip Coleman from Trinity College, Dublin in Ireland. Philip Coleman is a lecturer in the School of English, where he's also a fellow. And being named a fellow of Trinity College, Dublin is a great honor and a venerable tradition that also comes with privileges. And if I remember correctly, among other things, it allows the fellow to ride a horse onto the college green, or so Philip once told me. Besides, Philip is an expert in American literature and has in his research also covered the intersections between American and Irish literature and culture in various ways. He has published extensively on US American poetry and short fiction. His most recent publications include the selected letters of John Berryman, which he co-edited with Callista McRae, and which was published by Harvard University Press in 2020, and Robert Lowell and Irish Poetry, which he co-edited with Eve Cobain, and which was published by Peter Lang also in 2020. Today, he will talk about the depiction of animals, not horses though, but cats, in the poetry of Irish poet William Butler Yeats and American poet John Berryman. Philip, we are delighted that you are here with us today, if only virtually, and we are very much looking forward to your talk. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ina. I should just mention immediately that I haven't yet taken up that privilege of riding a horse through front gate, but someday, someday I will do this. But no, it really is wonderful to be here. And I'm just going, before I get started, if I may just share my screen so that I can get my slides ready. So just one moment. Perfect. And I'm going to take your advice now, Ina, also, and I'm going to just put that up there. I'll leave that there. Okay, thanks so much, Professor Dr. Bergman. I also just want to thank Professor Eisenman for this really wonderful invitation to give this lecture today. I do have to also, haven't seen in far too long, Professor Jochen Achilles, who I believe is in the audience, and lovely to know that you're here also, Jochen. It really is a great honor to be asked to speak as part of this wonderful series. And as you've just said, Ina, it's such a pity we can't meet in person, but my email address is here on the first slide, and I would be very happy to hear from people afterwards. If, sometimes in the Q&A, maybe, you're trying to gather your thoughts or you have a response that you'd like to share, do feel free to get in touch with me afterwards if you wish. So can everybody hear me okay at this point, Ina? Just give me, everything's fine?
Yes.
Yeah, good. So before I begin, I should also just mention that the original title for this lecture was simply Yeats and Cats. And it might be helpful just to keep that in mind as I move through the different materials I've assembled for today's talk. If an opportunity comes up again, I'd be very happy to come to Würzburg and talk about Yeats and horses, if you really want me to do that. But as my title suggests, I'll also be talking about the American poet John Berryman. Now, initially, I set myself the title Yeats and Cats as a kind of challenge to see how far I could go with it. And in fact, the topic has turned out to be more productive and indeed more complex than I thought, and perhaps can even cover in a single talk. I did give a version of this lecture at the Yates Summer School last August, and after that event, I felt that there was still a lot more to be said, and certainly there's a lot more to discuss about it. So my talk today isn't in any way complete. My approach is going to be kind of exploratory. It's going to be tentative, a little bit like the cat we encounter in that wonderful poem, The Young Cat and the Chrysanthemums, where he describes the cat starting, advancing indirectly. So let's see where we end up. Okay, so part one, there are going to be 5 parts in the lecture. So when I get to part 5, which is a very short kind of conclusion, you'll know that we're nearly there. Part 1, it's wonderful the way cats bound about. It's wonderful the way cats bound about, John Berryman writes in the first line of Dream Song 223, beginning what we might expect to be a lyric meditation on the feline species. After this first line, however, the song turns abruptly to the human realm. Here we go. It continues, it's wonderful the way cats bound about. It's wonderful how men are not found out so far. It's miserable how many miserable are over the spread world at this tick of time. These mysteries that I'm rehearsing in the dark did brighter minds much bother through them ages, whom one finds guilty for failure. Up all we rose with dawn, springy for pride, trying all morning. Dazzled I subside at noon. Noon be my jailer, and afternoon the deepening of the task poor Henry set himself long since to ask. Why? Who? When? I don't know, Mr. Bones. You ask too much of such as you and me and we and such fast cats, worse men. So this dream song touches on the idea of guilt, which is a major theme for John Berryman, but it's also about art, and specifically about the failure of art, and indeed the failings of the artist. Centrally, Dream Song 223 addresses the crisis experienced by the poet when they realize that they cannot adequately understand the mysteries they have set themselves to question. Why, who, when? The character of poor Henry here, this is the imaginary character at the center of Berryman's long poem, The Dream Songs. Poor Henry cannot answer these questions, but his interlocutor provides an interesting response in the last 3 lines of the Dream Song. I don't know, Mr. Bones. You asks too much of such as you and me and we and such fast cats, worse men. In the last line then, cats come back into the picture, but in the figurative sense, I think, common in US American culture in the middle decades of the 20th century when Berryman was writing. In the Oxford English Dictionary, a cat is defined not just as a well-known carnivorous quadruped, but also as an expert in or one expertly appreciative of jazz. This is in the slang usage mentioned here. So the last 3 lines of Berryman's Dream Song are also spoken in what Anthony Lane has called black voice, the unembarrassed minstrelsy that is, in an important sense, the source of the greatest failure of Berryman's art. This is something that Kamran Javadizadeh has drawn attention to in an essay on Berryman in the New York Review of Books this year. And for many readers, it's one of the most profoundly problematic aspects of Berryman's work. So at the same time that the poet is said to be a fast cat, then, an expert jazz musician, if you like, whose work bounds about with startling leaps and gestures of sound and meaning, he is a worse man. a person whose art and life, it seems, are undermined by different kinds of excess. He is one who asks too much of such as you and me, you and we and me. Berryman is the maker of a kind of art, in other words, that makes impossible demands on its readers, demands that many readers today are no longer willing to make due to its deeply troubling racial ventriloquism in particular. However, the poet's personal commitment to his art also came at a price in terms of its toll on his physical and mental health and well-being. Suffering from alcoholism and depression, Berryman's personal life and professional life in turmoil, he died by suicide at the age of 57 in 1972. So what does all of this have to do with William Butler Yeats? Well, it seems to me that Dream Song 223 can be read as a kind of response to Yeats's very well-known poem, The Choice, which, of course, you'll know begins as follows. The intellect of man is forced to choose perfection of the life or of the work, and if it take the second, must refuse a heavenly mansion raging in the dark. Berryman's image in that dream song of the artist rehearsing mysteries in the dark clearly alludes to Yeats's poem, but also in its phrasing, but also in its revisiting of Yeats's statement of a theme that resonates throughout the history of 20th century poetry. In the next dream song in the sequence, indeed, and just to say that the Dream Songs is a long poem divided into 385 songs. In the next dream song in the sequence, Berryman considers perhaps the most troubling of all 20th century Anglophone poets in this regard, and that is, in my view, Ezra Pound, whose support for Benito Mussolini continues to divide readers. In Dream Song 224, which is the next one in the sequence, which is given the title 80, Berryman considers Pound at the funeral of T.S. Eliot at Westminster Abbey in 1965. That dream song begins, lonely in his great age, Henry's old friend leaned on his burning cane, while his old friend was hymned out of the living. The abbey rang with sound. Pound, white as snow, bowed to them with his thoughts. It's hard to know them, though, for the old man sang no word. Now, one could be forgiven on first reading this stanza of Dream Song 224 that the abbey here is the theatre in Dublin that Yeats helped to found, but it isn't. This is clearly not the case in literal terms, but the association is part of the kind of dream logic of Berryman's longer work, in which it's also often hard to know precisely what the poet is saying. In this dream song, for example, repeated references to whiteness call for attention. Pound is white as snow in the first stanza, followed by the image of his albino body failing in the second. And in the final lines of the dream song, we read, white is the hue of death and victory, all the old generosities dismissed, while the white years insist. Berryman is not only referring to Pound's skin color and his hair color in these images, although this is interesting, I think, given the larger racial drama of the dream songs and Berryman's use of minstrelsy. All of these references to whiteness suggest innocence too, and in a way, the dream song urges us to acknowledge Ezra Pound's old generosities, against which his purported crimes, and in particular his anti-Semitism, might be measured. So moving from the opening of Dream Song 223 with its image of cats bounding about to Ezra Pound, white as snow at the funeral of T.S. Eliot in Dream Song 224, we find ourselves as readers in the company of a group of writers, Berryman, Yeats, Pound, and Eliot, for whom questions of guilt and failure have often been raised, and indeed, these are questions that continue to trouble us today. Moreover, the source of this guilt often has to do with certain errors of judgment, personal and political errors of judgment that impacted on the practice of their art and continue to undermine our sense of their achievement. And William Butler Yeats is central to this discussion, not just because his poem, The Choice, provides the best summary of the particular tension between life and work that is at stake here, or because he is himself a problematic case in this regard, but also because he was so central to the poetic culture of his time, of the 20th century. As T.S. Eliot put it in 1940, Yeats was one of those few whose history is the history of their own time, who are a part of the consciousness of an age which cannot be understood without them. As Yeats is reported to have said himself, "I am king of the cats." This is how he summed it up. So I want to explore this a little more in the second part now, which I take Yeats's claim for the title of the second part. John Berryman once said that he began work as a poet in verse making, as he put it, as a burning trivial disciple of the great Irish poet William Butler Yeats. And in an essay written in 1949, he described Ezra Pound also as a most odd disciple of their Irish precursor. In Berryman's words, Pound went to London in 1908 at 23 to learn from Yeats how to write poetry, in the belief that no one then living knew more about it. Swinburne was just alive when he died the following April. "I am king of the cats," said Yeats to one of his sisters meeting her in the street, inaccessible behind Watts Dunton. Now, Berryman's dig at Theodore Watts Dunton is interesting, I think, given that Watts Dunton effectively saved Swinburne from early alcoholic self-destruction. But his recollection of Yeats's line, Berryman's recollection of Yeats's line about becoming king of the cats, reminds us not only of the Irish poet's sense of his own authority, but the high esteem in which the young Pound and indeed the later Berryman held him. In a sense, they both also wondered if they were king of the cats after Yeats's death. But as Berryman puts it in Dream Song 312, Yeats persisted as a majestic shade whose influence remained strong right to the end of his career. So Berryman may have seen himself as a fast cat, as he puts it in Dream Song 223, but was he ever king of the cats, as Yeats claimed himself to be? And what about Pound? In the third section of A Packet for Ezra Pound, which was first published in 1929 and later included in the second edition of A Vision in 1937, Yeats considers Pound in terms of the younger American poet's treatment of cats in Rapallo in the winter of 1927-28. The scholar Lauren Arrington has written a brilliant account of this period in the development of both poets, of Yeats and Pound, in her essay, Feeding the Cats, Yeats and Pound at Rapallo, 1928, which is in this marvelous book of essays, Uncertain Futures, edited by Sinia Pasita. And Arrington's book, The Poets of Rapallo, I recommend also as an excellent discussion of the relationship between Yeats, Pound, and several other modernist writers, including Basil Bunting, Dorothy Pound, George Yeats, and others. Like Arrington, I'm interested in Yeats's connections with this wider network of younger modernists, and especially John Berryman. And this passage that I'm going to read now from A Packet from Ezra Pound provides a lens through which we can, A Packet for Ezra Pound, it provides a kind of lens through which we can open up the questions of artistic achievement, authority, guilt, and failure that I've already introduced in my reading of Dream Song 223. In the third section of A Packet, Yeats writes about Ezra Pound as follows. Sometimes at 10 o'clock at night, I accompany him to a street where there are hotels upon one side, upon the other palm trees and the sea, and there, taking out of his pocket bones and pieces of meat, he begins to call the cats. He knows all their histories. The brindled cat looked like a skeleton until he began to feed it. That fat grey cat is an hotel proprietor's favorite. It never begs from the guests' tables, and it turns cats that do not belong to the hotel out of garden. This black cat and that grey cat over there fought on the roof of a 4-storied house some weeks ago, fell off a whirling ball of claws and fur, and now avoid each other. Yet now that I recall the scene, I think that he has no affection for cats. Some of them so ungrateful, a friend says. He never nurses the cafe cat. I cannot imagine him with a cat of his own. Cats are oppressed. Dogs terrify them. Landladies starve them. Boys stone them. Everybody speaks of them with contempt. If they were human beings, we could talk of their oppressors with a studied violence, add our strength to theirs, even organize the oppressed, and like good politicians, sell our charity for power. I examine his criticism in this new light, his praise of writers pursued by ill luck, left maimed or bedridden by the war, and thereupon recall a person as unlike him as possible, the only friend who remains to me from late boyhood, grown gaunt in the injustice of what seems her blind nobility of pity. I will fight until I die, she wrote me once, against the cruelty of small ambitions. Was this pity a characteristic of his generation that has survived the romantic movement, and of mine and hers that saw it die, I too a revolutionist, some drop of hysteria at the bottom of the cup? Now, I think this is a remarkable passage for a number of reasons. Within the space of a few sentences, we move from this detailed account of a poet, Yeats's account of Pound feeding cats in Rapallo, innocent enough, I suppose, in itself and even comical, but it moves very quickly to a meditation on the idea of oppression and the claim that Pound stood up for oppressed writers and those who were left maimed or bedridden by the war, as Yeats puts it. So Yeats here is asking us to view Ezra Pound in this light, in the same way that Berryman, 40 years later, will ask us to remember all of Pound's old generosities in Dream Song 224. The passage is very much about Ezra Pound then, but it also dwells on the problem, which was so important to Yeats, about what to do with the drop, as he says, the drop of hysteria still at the bottom of the cup, the excess of political energy and emotion that can in fact destroy artistic genius. Even in 1928, Yeats may have realized that this would be Ezra Pound's downfall, and it is a source of real tension in his work too. For a poet who saw himself as king of the cats, it is striking that Pound is cast here as the feeder and not as a cat himself. And is there anything in this, I wonder? Did Pound not also feed Yeats in some sense? Ernest Hemingway has said that Pound dedicates 1/5 of his time to poetry. With the rest of his time, he tries to advance the fortunes, both material and artistic, of his friends. He defends them when they are attacked. He gets them into magazines and out of jail. He sells their pictures, arranges concerts for them, writes articles about them, introduces them to wealthy women, gets publishers to take their books, and so on. Ezra Pound, then, was the modernist literary enabler par excellence, assisting several major writers and artists, many of them fast cats indeed, to advance their careers, including Hemingway, Joyce, Eliot, H.D., and of course, Yeats. So Pound was, as Yeats suggests, a great feeder of cats, but was this to the detriment of his own art? If Pound is not a cat, of course, then the older Yeats, the self-proclaimed king of the cats, has nothing to fear from him, this young gun, unless he is some other kind of oppressor. For now, though, Yeats can continue, as he says further on in a packet, to be satisfied with Ezra Pound's society and that of his traveling Americans. He has nothing to fear from them, but for several generations, many American poets, including Berryman, will in fact doubt their own authority in the light of Yeats's example. And just to reference a couple of really useful books on this, Terence Diggory's book published in 1983, but still very readable and very useful on Yeats and American poetry, and Stephen Matthews' wonderful book, Yeats as Precursor, which was published in 2002, really interesting books on Yeats's influence on American poets in the 20th century. Now, in the section just before the one where he describes Pound feeding the cats in A Packet for Ezra Pound, Yeats describes the way that seemingly irrelevant details fit together in the cantos, that is Pound's kind of great epic work, how they fit into a single theme. Here is no botch of tone and color, all hodos chameleontos, except for some odd corner where one discovers beautiful detail, like that finely modeled foot in Portia's disastrous picture. And I want to take two things from this. First, as Warwick Gould, the critic Warwick Gould, argues in an essay on Pound and Yeats published in 1993, this is a deeply studied insult, as well as a frustrated, even tragic half-compliment to Pound. And secondly, it reminds us that Yeats is himself a great poet of the isolated image, what he calls here the beautiful detail, even if he is most valued for the ways that his works cohere into what Edward Engelberg famously called a vast design. This is another, I think, really important study of Yeats, which was published all the way back in 1963. Yeats managed over the course of his career to make the beautiful details fit into larger patterns, but Pound struggled to do this. As he writes in Canto 116, published in 1962, I have brought the great ball of crystal. Who can lift it? Can you enter the great acorn of light? But the beauty is not the madness, though my errors and wrecks lie about me, and I cannot make it cohere. Pound's sense of his own aesthetic failure has a personal as well as a political, possibly even an ethical dimension. And I think Yeats was onto this. He was aware of this problem several decades earlier. And Berryman also saw that Pound's work did not cohere, but his method in creating a framework for the Dream Songs, his own epic, was not unproblematic either in aesthetic or ideological terms. Neither Berryman nor Pound, however, was a match for W.B. Yeats. To both of them, no matter how hard they tried to achieve their own authority, Yeats remained the king of the cats. So in this third section, I want to look a little bit closer at what I'm calling Yeats's feline fantasies. It's a wonderful photograph, I think, of Yeats and convalescence there with a cat on his lap. As Stephen Parrish has noted when he was compiling the concordance to Yeats's poems in the 1960s, there is a profusion of animals in Yeats's work, both on the hoof, as it were, and in the vehicle of metaphor. But there aren't, in fact, that many cats in Yeats's poems. Parrish counts 14, and most of these are repeated instances of the same cat, which leads us to see that there are, in fact, only a few representatives of the feline species to be found across his oeuvre. The most memorable and powerfully distinct of which is probably Black Minnolucia in The Cat and the Moon. This is the cat I mentioned in my title. Now, I should say at this point that Yeats's kind of animal poems have been read in the context of, animal studies, and especially within the context of the field of kind of critical animal studies in recent years. But my interest is far more modest and is rather a part of what Stephen Parrish calls the exploration of the strange, dazzling, highly organized, but often ill-charted worlds created by symbolist and mythopoetic genius. Although they only appear in a few instances, in other words, I want to ask what role do cats play in Yeats's poetry and in the mythopoetic projections of his career, and indeed in the afterlife of his poetry as it is picked up by a poet like Berryman. So, though it's not listed in Parish's concordance, one of the earliest hints of a cat in Yeats's poetry, I think, is to be found in a poem called The Meditation of the Old Fisherman, which was written in 1886 and included in his volume Crossways in 1889, just after the well-known poem Down by the Sally Gardens. And I say hint of a cat because in the opening stanza of the meditation of the old fisherman, as the old fisherman ponders the waves that dance by his feet like children at play, they do so with the sound and motion, I think, of a cat. You waves, though you dance by my feet like children at play, though you glow and you glance, though you purr and you dart, in the dunes that were warmer than these are, the waves were more gay when I was a boy with ne'er a crack in my heart. The purr and the dart of the water here is creaturely, or more precisely, it's cat-like in its movement and music. Like a living creature, it has been susceptible to the passing of time, and it provokes the figure of the fisherman into a reverie, a dream, a daydream about time, age, experience, and love. The waves upon which the old fisherman meditates then are truly shadowy waters, to borrow the title of Yeats's slightly later and longer dramatic poem, and the book that takes that title of 1906. In the lines dedicated to Lady Gregory at the start of that volume, indeed, another of Yeats's cats appears, a marten cat, in the company of a badger and a fox in that old wood wise Biddy Early called the Wicked Wood. The forest of Yeats's imagination, as Stephen Parish observed, is thickly populated with animals, and when they appear, no matter what form they take, we need to take note. As the example of the meditation of the old fisherman suggests, they are often very well hidden from sight, and they can turn up in the most unexpected of places. And this is all the more reason, I think, why we need to consider the example of Black Minalucia, that mysterious cat who appears not only in Yeats's poem The Cat and the Moon, which was collected in The Wild Swans at Coole in 1919, but also in the play of the same title, The Cat and the Moon, which was written in 1917, but not in fact published until 1924, and subsequently performed in the Abbey Theatre on a number of occasions in the 1920s and 30s. Now, these dates are interesting, not just in terms of the history of the work's composition, publication, and performance, but also because they suggest that Black Minalucia, this cat, this image, this kind of creature, stayed with Yeats over the course of nearly 3 decades, decades during which, let's not forget, Yeats saw himself as the king of the cats. On the one hand, The Cat and the Moon is a very straightforward poem. Its imagery and diction are more immediately accessible than many of Yeats's poems can often be. However, scholars from Grover Smith and Carl Benson in the 1940s and 50s to Yoko Sato in 2015 have shown just how complicated it is, and especially in terms of its sources, which range from Demetrius to Madame Blavatsky and the Japanese dramatic mode called Kyogen, which Yeats knew through his engagements with Pound, and especially Pound's work on Ernest Fenollosa in the 1910s. It is a text, in other words, that exists in 2, if not 3 forms. It is a poem, it is a play, and it is also a poem within a play. And it brings together many of Yeats's interests, literary and esoteric. It is also, in a way, a very personal poem, drawing as it does on Yeats's friendship with Maud Gonne for Minalucia's name. As Lester Connor writes, Minalucia was the name of a black Persian cat belonging to Maud Gonne at the time Yeats was a house guest at her place in Calvados, France in 1917. Yeats refers to this, as Connor notes, in Paramica Silentia Lunae, where Minalucia is described as a distraction, a creature who constantly interrupts conversation and thought. Of that text, Yeats writes, he advises Maud Gonne to read it someday when Minna Luce is asleep. But in The Cat and the Moon, the friendly silence of the moon, which is Yeats's translation of that title, the title of that prose work, the friendly silence of the moon is unsettled by the description of this pure, cold light in the sky, spinning round like a top that troubles the cat's animal blood. And here's the poem. It's short enough to read in its entirety. The Cat and the Moon. The cat went here and there, and the moon spun round like a top, and the nearest kin of the moon, the creeping cat, looked up. Black Minna Luce stared at the moon, for, wander and wail as he would, the pure cold light in the sky troubled his animal blood. Minna Luce runs in the grass, lifting his delicate feet. Do you dance, Minna Luce, do you dance? When two close kindred meet, what better than call a dance? Maybe the moon may learn, tired of that courtly fashion, a new dance turn. Minna Luce creeps through the grass, from moonlit place to place. The sacred moon overhead has taken a new phase. Does Minna Luce know that his pupils will pass from change to change, and that from round to crescent, from crescent to round they range? Minna Luce creeps through the grass, alone, important and wise, and lifts to the changing moon his changing eyes. The speaker doesn't have adequate terms here to describe the cat's movements. Do you dance, Minna Luce? Do you dance? The poem's questions, indeed, reinforce a sense of epistemological but also spiritual distance between the speaker and the cat, a gap that is emphasized by the suggestion that Minna Luce may have insights into the moon's phases that the speaker doesn't share. So much more than merely a poem about a cat, then, The Cat and the Moon is a text in which Yeats expresses a desire to become Minna Luce, to assume feline form in a way that will give him access to mysteries that are beyond the limitations of human understanding. Yeats often thought of human beings assuming animal form. And this, what I'm calling this feline fantasy of his, is prefigured, for example, in a passage from the Vision Papers, in which George Yeats records a night where the interpreter dreams she was a cat, kept on making a sound like lapping. When I told Cat to go away, she tried to get out of bed. I held her and told Cat to come back. And perhaps Yeats's ultimate feline fantasy occurs in The Second Coming, this very well-known poem, where we encounter somewhere in the sands of the desert a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun. Here, the king of the cats, W.B. Yeats, imagines himself at one with the king of the beasts in a projection that presents the poet ecstatically caught up in his own vision. Surely, he says, some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Here, Yeats attempts to outdo Minna Luce's lunar meditations by imagining a creature whose ability to see combines human and animal form, a creature whose gaze is blank and pitiless as the sun. And it's at moments like this, I want to suggest, that Yeats is most powerful in his belief that he is indeed the king of the cats. At this moment, his feline fantasy, as it were, reaches its ultimate expression in an image that combines Yeats's personal, political, mystical, and artistic desires in a single devastating image that not even he could fully understand or accept. He can't fully comprehend this rough beast that has erupted out of his imagination. As he writes in the poem, the darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. So just going into part 4, and then we'll be on to the concluding section shortly. Part 4, Berryman's Feline Nightmare. Now, in an article published in 2015, Patrick Keane describes an unpublished poem in which Yeats apparently addresses Maud Gonne as follows: "It is of you I sing when I tell of the swan in the water." Keane continues, "Even a creature of change, a charming yet mysterious replicator of the lunar phases, who in The Cat and the Moon creeps through the grass alone, important and wise, and lifts to the changing moon his changing eyes, even this is related to lunar Maud. Referred to by name, Minalusha was her black male Persian." And Maud Gonne's Persian cat is certainly one of the sources for black Minalusha in The Cat and the Moon. So is it any wonder that Yeats harbored such a deep fantasy to become his beloved's cat? There is throughout Yeats's body of work then something like a double of the poet himself, the self-proclaimed king of the cats. And as I move towards my conclusion, I want to suggest that Berryman picked up on this and he worked it into the deep symbolic patterning of the dream songs. I've already mentioned John Berryman's admission in 1965 that he began work in verse making as a burning trivial disciple of the great Irish poet William Butler Yeats. In the same piece, Berryman said that he didn't so much wish to resemble as to be Yeats. And I think one of the reasons why Berryman worried so much about failure as an artist was because he believed he had not reached the same heights as Yeats in his work, even after he had effectively completed the Dream Songs in 1969. Berryman worried continually that he would not also have the late flowering that Yeats had in his 50s, when, partly due to his friendship with Ezra Pound, he produced the poems of Michael Roberts and the Dancer and The Tower in 1928. Even more so, to the end of his life, John Berryman was troubled by the fact that, unlike Yeats, he had not managed to write any plays, any decent plays, apart from a few short pieces, chamber pieces he wrote when he was a student in the 1930s. Now, Berryman wrote about Yeats's plays in a review of the collected plays that was published in the Columbia Review in 1936. There he describes Yeats's At the Hawkswell and The Cat and the Moon as slight in effectiveness as well as in range. But he also noted in his commentary on the plays, he also noted the interpretive potential of the latter, stating that the system of symbolic reference within the play is not explained, and a dozen interpretations, all tentative, are possible. So I want to suggest now that the play provided Berryman with a source for the figures of Henry and his interlocutor in the Dream Songs. And through this and a larger meditation on Yeats as the king of the cats, he created the figure of what he calls Henry Pussycat. Like the Dream Songs, The Cat and the Moon is a text that proceeds through moments of dialogue and song, with the central speakers, a blind beggar and a lame beggar, cutting across and disagreeing, even threatening each other at every turn. Moreover, in Yeats's play, we are told that their faces are made up to resemble masks, which of course is taken up by Berryman and translated into a 20th century US American context through his presentation of Henry as a white American in early middle age who appears sometimes in blackface in the Dream Songs. Now, I believe that Berryman knew that this was a very risky maneuver, aesthetically and politically, and it's something he acknowledges in the Dream Songs. His project, the Dream Songs as a whole, spun out of control, and I think he struggled in the last few years of his life to recover or indeed to escape from what it had become and what it had made of him. He knew, in short, that it would not make him king of the cats in the Yeatsian sense. Now, there are several references to cats in the Dream Songs, and the work's central figure, Henry, as I've said, is given the surname Pussycat in many places. At least two of these relate directly to the theme of authority that the image of the cat brings to mind when considered in relation to Yeats's earlier self-projections. Here is the first stanza of Dream Song 90, for example, in which Berryman writes an elegy for the poet and critic Randall Jarrell. In the chambers of the end, we'll meet again. I will say Randall, he'll say Pussycat, and all will be as before when, as we sought among the beloved faces, eminence, and were dissatisfied with that and needed more. Berryman was never satisfied merely to seek eminence. He needed to know, like Yeats, that he was the greatest poet alive. And this is perhaps the curse of white male poetry in the 20th century. The fact that so many poets, straight men in the Anglophone tradition mainly, are obsessed with their own authority. From Yeats and Pound to Berryman and Lowell, this issue recurs in ways that not only make them seem increasingly unpalatable, but also in each case seems to have driven them to do things for the sake of their art that one would like to believe went against their better judgment. From Pound's anti-Semitism to Berryman's use of minstrelsy and Robert Lowell's theft of Elizabeth Hardwicke's letters in the making of his late sonnets. All of these, I think, representing incredible errors of judgment. And when you try to weigh those up against the kind of intellectual gifts that each of these writers had, it's very hard to reconcile the two things. In the case of Berryman and Lowell in particular, these decisions were driven by a desire to be original, to do something new. But in each case, it seems, in retrospect, they were mistaken. And I think Berryman acknowledges something of this at times. And here's an example in Dream Song 231, which takes the form of an ode addressed to James Thomson. Ode to that boring shit, James Thomson, seasonal. Now gently rail on Henry Pussycat, for he did bad, and punished he must be by them, and by them, and by all. He'll lose his place in the book, and each thing that ever he valued. He'll lose his minstrelsy. Vainly will topics call for cunning putting to who smashed his lyre, drowned his harmonica, covered with foes, and coughed with horror, and gave uts. One word of them, he'll lose his scholar ire, periant qui, a voyeur, oh, and those, the slob's associates, the aggressive tease, shockful of malice, the dead end out of conflict father, the clever brother and the dull, the nosy Jesuit, a tribe to lose to. I lose my right hand. She lost the honor of a word. Ah, well, Henry fell among it. The word seasonal in the title suggests that the song is dedicated to James Thomson, the 18th century poet and the author of a long poem called The Seasons, as well as The Castle of Indolence and the lyrics of Rule Britannia, rather than the 19th century poet of the same name, whose most famous work is, of course, The City of Dreadful Night. In a way, though, I think Berryman here is referring to both Thomsons, the two poets from different centuries whose works became increasingly insignificant and unknown in Berryman's time, a fate he fears here for his own work too, the fear of not being remembered. Indeed, this worry is expressed as a form of guilt, the idea that he will be found out for doing bad and will consequently, as he puts it, lose his place in the book and each thing that ever he valued, including his minstrelsy. Unmasked, Berryman fears that he will become irrelevant and unread, and this is, without a doubt, one of the biggest issues facing his legacy today. It is a legacy, however, that has its origins in Berryman's deep desire not only to resemble but to be Yeats, albeit by transforming himself into a different kind of fast cat, one whose nightmare, to use Yeats's word from The Second Coming, was the problem of what to make of the self in the American century. Berryman was already playing with fire when he chose to be a burning, trivial disciple of Yeats at the start of his career. As he wrote in 1948, Yeats's personality is so distinct and powerful that few writers have cared to submit to it in the hope of coming out themselves. Berryman became himself for a while by assuming a feline mask, as Yeats had done in the figure of Henry Pussycat, but it was a performance that was destined to failure from the start. As he puts it somewhat wryly in Dream Song 322, I gave my love a cookie. It was her fate to be involved with Henry Pussycat. I feel only pity for her. I'll spare her all I can in Ireland and elsewhere. It must have been that cookie which she ate. Never take cookies from cats. Of course, the image calls to mind Ezra Pound's feeding of the cats at Rapallo, with Henry Pussycat recast now as the feeder and not the fed. Not the king of the cats, after all, but one perhaps best avoided. So almost done. Here's the final section, just another few minutes. I see it all now, the blind beggar says in The Cat and the Moon. The blue sky and the big ash tree and the well and the flat stone, all as I have heard the people say, and the things the praying people put on the stone, the beads and the candles and the leaves torn out of prayer books, and the hairpins and the buttons. It is a great sight and a blessed sight, but I don't see yourself, holy man. Is it up there, the big tree you are? Berryman picks up on this image in the very first Dream Song when he writes, once in a sycamore I was glad, all at the top, and I sang. In the second Dream Song, indeed, the buttons of Yeats's text become the big buttons of that song's advance into Berryman's epic. And it's here for the first time, indeed, in the second Dream Song, that cats appear. Polecats are coming, hurrah, hooray, we read in that song's second last line. The connections that I have tried to trace today between Berryman and Yeats are evidence of the American poet's deep reading of William Butler Yeats, and indeed the profound conscious and subconscious influence the Irish poet had on Berryman. Berryman paid close attention to what he called the image clusters that occur in a writer's work. And it's not at all an exaggeration, I think, to suggest that the figure of Henry Pussycat represents an attempt to become Yeats, or more specifically, to become the king of the cats. As I have suggested, however, Berryman's use of a racist device, blackface, in order to do this, ultimately undermines the value and originality of his vision. Now, there's a lot more to be said about the issues I've raised here, starting with this consideration of Yeats and cats. In addition to the idea of the poet assuming feline form, I think there is some potential too for thinking about poetic form itself in feline terms. In relation to the poetry of Berryman, the co-editor of the selected letters of Berryman, Callista McRae, has published this wonderful book in which she says that even at their most turbulent, the dream songs are fitted into a form that resembles a well-wrought urn. They're very well made, very well crafted, and I think this is certainly the case. But I'm reminded also of the American sculptor Alexander Calder's description of cats in his lovely book, How to Draw. This is what he says. It was published in 1926. He says, remember that action in a drawing is not necessarily comparable to physical action. A cat asleep has intense action. Cats, incidentally, make splendid models. The feline looseness and flexibility of limb have more grace in them than the more jerky movements of some other animals. One can almost see what a cat is thinking about. One can almost see what a cat is thinking about. Berryman's poetry, like that of William Butler Yeats, has intense action, even when the verse appears to be asleep or fitted to particular forms. And this is the case in the dream songs. Each song is, 3 6-line stanzas written to a very particular formal template but yet there's always so much going on within each stanza, within each form, even though it appears to be very tightly constructed. In reading them both, in reading Yeats and Berryman, we often find that we can only almost see what they are thinking about. It isn't always possible to know precisely what they are trying to say. And I think they both take, go to great extremes often to kind of obscure the thing it is that might be behind what it is they are saying. It is indeed wonderful then, as Berryman says, and I quoted this at the start, it is indeed wonderful the way that cats bound about, but they will not be easily bound by our criticism. As Calder puts it, when the cat is awake, we need to take particular care to get the attitude right. All the muscles tense, ears erect, eyes observant, tail poised to give the best balance for a sudden spring, and who knows where it may land next. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Philip, for your talk. This use of images of cats in Yates's and Berryman's poetry, at least to me, was at points very surprising. And I think it's also very revealing in some respects, as you have shown, and especially in the context of the influence Yeats had on Berryman, or how Berryman was influenced by Yeats. So thanks very much. A very thought-provoking lecture today. And I'd like to open up the floor for the discussion. If you want to ask a question, if you want to leave a comment, since we are a very large group, it would be best if you used your virtual yellow hand. And the floor is open for questions.
Thanks so much, Gina.
Oh, okay. We already have a first question by Marcel Haas, who's not able to talk to us, but obviously is able to listen. So I'll read that out to you, Philip, and then we can discuss this. So Marcel asks, why did modernist poets and authors communicated and appreciate it? Why did they communicate and appreciate each other's work, even though they had different political ideologies? Considering Hemingway's comment on Ezra Pound you've presented at the beginning of the lecture, I mainly think about Yeats, an Irish nationalist, Hemingway, a moderate to left-winger, and Ezra Pound, who was palpably fascist and even lived in fascist Italy, not to mention their obsession with authority and, as far as I understood, a hierarchical perception of their art and skill. Did the authors just ignore these differences and focus mainly on their work in order to assist each other?
What a great question, Marcel. Thank you very much. I've just been reading it here in the chat also. I mean, it's a fantastic question. I think there, like any good question, there are many ways to answer it. The first thing I would say is that when we talk about modernist poets and authors, of course, we're talking about a very diverse group, not just in the Anglophone traditions, in Ireland, in the United States, in England and elsewhere, but also across other languages and other cultures. So it would be wrong to kind of offer a summary statement and say that all modernist poets behaved this way or acted this way. And I think this gets to the heart of your question, that, you know, there are many examples of modernist poets who did not agree with Ezra Pound, who called him out, who challenged his anti-Semitism, and indeed who questioned his aesthetic and artistic achievement as well. And on the other hand, it is true. So the poets I was talking about today, in particular, Yeats and Berryman, I mean, I think that Berryman constructed a version of Yeats that was amenable to him. He was a huge admirer of Yeats, the formalist, Yeats, the great kind of late symbolist poet. But he overlooked many aspects of Yeats, and especially, like many readers, he overlooked Yeats's politics, which were also very much aligned with fascism and, you know, kind of troubling movements in Europe in the 1920s and 30s in particular. Equally, I think it is the case that, you know, while Yeats does worry at times about Pound's support for Mussolini. He worries in his private correspondence about that. He nonetheless does admire his artistic achievement. And so often you find among certain writers, not all, but among certain writers, you find that they can separate out the kind of the aesthetic from the ideological in ways that many of us today would find really would be very uncomfortable with this division. So I think that's part of it. I think part of it from an US American context, I suppose part of it has to do with the hegemony of the new criticism in the middle decades of the 20th century. And for many American poets, especially middle generation poets like John Berryman, Robert Lowell, Randall Jarrell, and others, there is a sense in which politics really isn't a part of how we consider aesthetic achievement in poetry, that it kind of should be pushed to one side. So Berryman very much in his engagements with both Pound and Yeats, and for, I think against his better judgment, was able to just bracket off the very real political concerns that many other writers had. So it's an excellent question. And I think I would just respond in that way. And I mean, you're quite right when you say, Yeats is an Irish nationalist. I mean, it's not the nationalism that, his Irish, in kind of support of the Irish state that bothers me with Yeats. It's his support of fascism and fascist movements in Europe at the time. And certainly now, I will say as well that there are other modernist poets who are not aligned with these political movements and who became increasingly troubled by them. So some of the objectivist poets, for example, Louis Zukofsky, in particular, George Oppen, who were very, very uncomfortable about the anti-Semitic side of Pound's work in particular, and distanced themselves from him.
Yes, thank you very much for that answer, Philip. And Marcel, thank you again for your question. Yeah, we do already have another question. Antonius.
So first, I wanted to thank you for the insightful talk. I really didn't see the connection, especially with the focus on cats. I mean, practically, I would have read just through it and wouldn't have thought much about it, but there is so much to gather out of a few lines if you really take all the context surrounding the piece itself and the author in consideration. But what I wanted to ask, since I sadly don't know much about Berryman yet, is whether you could maybe explain where this feeling of failure comes from, this aesthetic failure. Is it connected, or was Berryman reflecting on his use of minstrelsy, or is this one thing that we consider now? Or where exactly is this point where Berryman says that he failed? Is it because he didn't achieve to be as Yeats, or didn't achieve to be the king of the cats? Or
yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, Antonius. Thank you very much for being here, and listening and for asking this. So Berryman wrote one of the first critical studies of Stephen Crane, wonderful late 19th century American, mainly fiction writer. You probably know the Red Badge of Courage. And so Berryman wrote one of the first critical studies of Crane's work. It was published in 1950. And in that study, in fact, Crane has just been the subject of an 800-page book by Paul Auster, so he's kind of having a bit of a resurgence. But in that study, Berryman says about Crane, he's doing a kind of close reading of some of Crane's poems, and he's trying to get to, the kind of like, where is it all coming from? And in the end, he kind of throws his hands up in the air and says, who knows how many sources a deep work has? And I often keep this in mind when I'm reading Berryman himself or reading other writers as complex as Yeats, because I think that Berryman certainly had a sense that, that there is no single source that one can point to in a deep work, in a work that is as complex as some of his own poetry is. So that's one way of answering the question, I suppose, in terms of, when you're asking, where does this, what is the source for this? Where does it come from? Your question also relates to the idea of authority, and Berryman's sense, I think, that he never fully achieved the kind of authority he believed somebody like Yeats, and possibly even someone like Pound had achieved before him. He was very self-conscious about his decision to try and emulate Yeats as an early poet. There's an early poem by him called A Point of Age, in which he says, "Carefully we choose our fathers, carefully we choose those on whom to exert the politics of praise." And this is a completely different view of kind of literary influence to that kind of, the kind of Bloomian sense that somehow the precursor is irresistible, that the poet has no say in the matter, that they overwhelm you, and you can do nothing about it except try and achieve your own. Berryman had a different view. He kind of sensed that, that as a young poet, as a young writer, that he could kind of choose the poets who he would be influenced by, and he chose Yeats. As he said, and I quoted this in the lecture, he says, "I began work in verse making as a burning, trivial disciple of the great Irish poet William Butler Yeats." So he turns to Yeats and he chooses him. And of course, in doing that, he's setting a very high standard for himself. A standard, by the way, which had been acknowledged and set by some of the kind of, some of the greatest kind of literary minds of the 20th century, including people like T.S. Eliot. So I think that, Berryman never fully felt that he had achieved that level as a poet. Now, the final part of your question, again, is, did this have something to do with the kind of racial ventriloquism? And I think it did. Berryman started writing dream songs, and then the work that became the dream songs, he started writing that in the 1950s. It was published in a number of installments, first in 1964, 77 dream songs. In 1968, His Toy, His Dream, His Rest, and then the complete 385 dream song kind of epic in 1969. And of course, all of this was happening during the civil rights movement, during a period in US American history when such important changes are taking place socially, changes that Berryman should have anticipated as a young man, but perhaps hadn't. And even though many of the kind of early reviewers and his publishers were, they didn't call him out on this in a way that he would be called out today. Like, Berryman was a serious writer. He was a scholar. He was an intellectual. He was, a Shakespeare scholar. He knew what he was doing. He thought about the strategies that, informed his work. And I think that over time, and I think the dream song I mentioned, the examples I mentioned kind of point at this, I think he became increasingly uncomfortable with this kind of mask that he was assuming to wear. So this is, I think, a great source of, failure, for him. Later on, most critics would agree that after the dream songs, Berryman's poetry is certainly diminished in quality. He published 2 books before his death, 2 books of poetry, one in the year of his death, Delusions, etc., another book in 1970 called Love and Fame. But he felt himself that these books did not achieve anything like the early success of the dream songs. So I don't know if that really answers the question, Antonios, but I'll just one final point on it and say that he was a poet who was also obsessed with the idea of authority, like many poets of the middle generation, Lowell included, obsessed with the idea that, who is the greatest? After Robert Frost died, which of us is number one now? Apparently, Berryman wrote to Lowell, who's number one? And I think that's a very unhealthy obsession, unhealthy for the individuals concerned, but also for their art, I would say. Yeah.
Yes,
does that answer the question?
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'd say it does. Antonios have to say if it does, but to me, it answered that question. Thank you for the question, Antonios, and thank you for the answer, Philip. The next question will come from Miriam.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. And I have to confess, I have 2 questions, if that's okay. One that piggybacks off essentially Antonios's question about minstrelsy, and then a shorter one about pussycats and women, those dimensions of the figure. And maybe I'll start with the minstrelsy question, and then the shorter question about the connection of this figure of the cat with women. I also have to pick up on this use of blackface and minstrelsy in Berryman, and I would be really interested in your thoughts about the particular appeal of this practice for modernist writers, for transatlantic modernist writers. I'm sure as a lot of people in the room know, T.S. Eliot had an absolutely embarrassing, from our perspective, fascination with this practice of blackface minstrelsy. He created over the course of his career these horrendous King Bolo poems with drawings. He corresponded with other poets in this mode. And it's interesting to see, it's interesting to see this sort of interest, or the appeal, the possibilities of this kind of mask or this kind of performance for later poets as well. And I'd be interested in your thoughts about what is the appeal of this? What are the poetic affordances? Why the attraction beyond like simply being like Eliot, I think it's more juvenile, informal kind of poetry. Berryman not. And I would also be interested in your thoughts about the tensions of using this kind of language or referencing, using this kind of practice in a transatlantic Irish-American context as well. Because of course the minstrelsy stage is famous for these caricatures of African-Americans, but other ethnic stereotypes underwent the same treatment of minstrelsy, particularly Irish figures, the Bridget, and so forth. So I'd be interested in your thoughts about that. Again, the sort of Anglo-US-Irish transatlantic dimension. Why minstrelsy? What is the appeal? And a far smaller question that came to my mind when you were talking about this obsession with mastery. This is obsession with masculine mastery, and then also this figure of the cat. The question that immediately comes up, what about the female figuration, the way in which the cat is, as very obviously in a phrase like pussycat, associated with women as well, and how that plays in. So, thank you.
That's a whole paper in itself, Marianne. Thank you. That's a great set of questions. I mean, just to the second point first, and it actually relates to the first question. It's interesting, when you mention the idea of, Henry Pussycat, and then you kind of, connect this up with the idea of mastery. And if we think of Pussycat as a kind of a female signifier, that in some sense, it kind of diminishes the idea of, the achievement or the mastery. It's kind of saying that somehow it's less powerful or less authoritative in some way. I mean, maybe that's part of what's going on. Maybe it's related to the sense of the kind of I suppose the kind of lack of authority in a way that Berryman might feel that that the blackface figure would actually have. So I want to come back to that, because I think that maybe we can come back to this, because I think that there is something also very troubling in Berryman in terms of how he engages with women actually in the poetry and the letters, for sure. It's something he was criticized for, especially in relation to his book Love and Fame, how he talks about old girlfriends and old lovers there in a very kind of autobiographical way, but in a very often very demeaning way. At the same time, we have to balance this out with, not balance it, but just try to reconcile it with the fact that among Berryman's most vocal advocates in the 60s was someone like Adrienne Rich, for example, right? So very outspoken feminist lesbian poet. So again, something that really troubles me about Berryman's reception is that we can say now, and you're quite right, it is embarrassing sometimes, but we need to move beyond embarrassment and just call it out and recognize the offensiveness. But it really does, I do find it remarkable that in his time in the 60s, during the civil rights era in particular, and during the kind of women's rights movement, that Berryman and other poets like him were not called out, but rather were supported by the whole literary establishment, other poets, critics, and publishers, mainstream major publishers like Farrar, Straus and Giroux. These were poets, after all, who were winning the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Award. They were being, profiled in magazines like Life magazine. So what was going on in that culture at that time, that writers who were clearly racist, who were clearly sexist, and I don't use those words lightly, but this is the case. You read the work, you can see that they are using racist strategies. They are often giving voice to sexist representations. Why were they not called out? So I do think that this is a question about the kind of the cultural politics of the period that has not yet been, in my view anyway, I haven't come across a really good study of this in relation to the poetry of the time. And a part of that for me is why then somebody like Rich, for example, or younger female writers, why they somehow participate in that. It's a really troubling question for me. Now, the earlier part of, and I'd love to know what your thoughts are on that also, Marianne and others, but to go back to the longer and kind of first part of your question about minstrelsy and why Berryman used this. So there are a couple of reasons behind this, I guess. One is that he read Karl Wittke's book on minstrelsy quite early on, and he seized on this idea of the end men, tambo and bones and the minstrelsy stage, and he seized on this as a way of kind of creating character within the long poem and creating voices. Berryman was also, I mentioned earlier, he was a Shakespeare scholar. Quite an accomplished Shakespeare scholar. In the late 40s, he produced, what was destined to be a really authoritative edition of King Lear, for example. He was interested in plays. He was interested in drama. And so I think he decided very early on that this long poem would have a kind of dramatic framework. The dramatic framework that he focused on, or that he decided to settle on, was that of minstrelsy. And again, you wonder about that. And, it's clear, I suppose, within the US American context, why it was appealing to Berryman. It allowed him to set up these kind of end men in the kind of traditional minstrel stage, or kind of tambo and bones. One of the characters in the Dream Songs is called Mr. Bones, after that figure in the kind of traditional minstrelsy setup. So that's part of what he was doing. He's trying to write a work in which his aesthetic and scholarly interests in theater could be brought together with his interest in the lyric. And that's what you get in the Dream Songs, this kind of, 385 lyric poems within a large scale kind of dramatic framework, in which these voices, in which these characters play off each other like end men in a kind of minstrelsy, in a kind of minstrel play. So there's the interest in drama that informs this, but I think there's also Berryman's desire, to do something that would pick up on what he thought may have been misguided in this, but what he thought were kind of certain energies in U.S. American culture in the 20th century. He was, obsessed with music, with jazz and the blues in particular. And I think that also, so he kind of wanted somehow to draw on the literature and music of Black America in the 20th century. What's astonishing in this, though, is that, so on the one hand, he's appropriating, he is using these models, he knows where they come from, he knows what he is doing, but nowhere in his work does he engage, for example, in any way, neither as a critic or as a scholar, as a teacher or as a poet, with people like Langston Hughes, for example, with any of the kind of Harlem Renaissance writers. He was born in 1914. He was a teenager in New York in the late 1920s. He went to Columbia in the 1930s. He nowhere acknowledges this. So on the one hand, you have this sense of him engaging in a very deliberate and open way for aesthetic reasons, all the while being quite naive about the political and ideological and social realities of those communities, where those forms are to be found. So he's drawing on that, but kind of completely oblivious to what's going on throughout the middle decades of the 20th century. On that point, I would just note as well that, it's a similar kind of evasion. It's a similar kind of silence that we have in 20th century US American critical history. If we think about what happened to Jean Toomer, what happened to Zora Neale Hurston, what happened to these writers after 1930, 1934. So they continued to write, but the critical establishment, of which Berryman would become increasingly a major figure in the 40s and 50s, ignored them, except, as you rightly point out, to use them for their own aesthetic ends. And this is what happens, I think, in the Dream Songs. So, you know, I think ultimately in Berryman, you know, and I tried to suggest this in the paper, but I think that gradually this kind of dawned on him that what he was doing here was appropriation. And he did, I think, begin to feel a certain amount of guilt about this. And this happened in the 60s, partly because of a friendship he had in that decade with Ralph Ellison, of course, the great writer of Invisible Man. So something like that, I think, probably did inform Berryman very, very much. Against that, though, you have to remember that, you know, among his kind of strongest American advocates were, like, you know, outright Southern racists like Alan Tate, you know? So it's a really great question. And I do think that, you know, maybe I've tried to cover too much in my answer, Marianne. I don't know if that helps at all, but what do you think? I mean,
no, thank you for your responses. I'm just kind of sorting through them. I mean, I think the sort of the possibilities that poets, writers like, say, T.S. Eliot, who's the writer I would know best about this, you know, I think you're absolutely spot on. It's about forms that you can adopt and use to hold poetic work together, but also about energies. This sort of, and this is kind of where we become very uncomfortable, the way it's about this idea that you're going to be able to pick up something like with all due scare quotes, sort of a primitive energy or a more folksy energy and what have you. And I do find it intriguing. You know, Eliot's is doing this, you know, at the start of the 20th century, that Berryman's doing it in the right dab smack in the middle, as you say. And I also find it interesting, I don't have it sorted out, you know, the willingness to, that somehow the advantages, what you can gain from doing that, seems to rank higher than the problems that Berryman is at the same time aware of as he's doing it. So it's interesting to keep thinking about. But thank you very much.
No, absolutely. I'll just add and say that, you know, I want to know, you know, what Berryman thought of a poem like Montage of a Dream Deferred by Langston Hughes. I want to know, you know, why there isn't more awareness of a text like that, and, you know, does he not see the kind of irony of him writing these dream songs given the histories that someone like Hughes needs to engage in? So there is, I mean, a really troubling kind of racial ventriloquism happening in Berryman, in Eliot, in you know, many other writers. Often I think there is a kind of naivety in the gesture, kind of doing something for aesthetic reasons, and it may well work on those terms, but, you know, I think then we need to think, but hang on a minute, it's also a form of appropriation. What is being appropriated? I mean, Hughes was very vocal about, you know, in his essay with, you know, the Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, that is the title of Hughes's, you know, really central essay, and he talked about the importance of tuning into folk culture. He felt, of course, that this was a necessary step for him to take as an artist. Berryman didn't have a right to do that, you know, and this is partly what he's trying to do here, I think. You mentioned also, Marianne, just come back to the Irish dimension. I just want to tell you one funny thing. I'll share this with everybody. A funny kind of thing about Berryman. So in 1966, Berryman won a Guggenheim grant, which he could spend abroad. I think the idea was that he would spend it abroad for the year. And I've looked in his kind of journals and diaries and from this time, and initially his hope was to come to London. But eventually he discovered that it would be too expensive to rent a house in London, and he was bringing his young family here and so on. And so he wrote in his diary that, you know, Dublin may be a better option because it was cheaper and they spoke English here. So again, sometimes we can rush to kind of romanticize the Irish connection, and it is there, and the Yeats connection is very strong. But at the end of the day, when Berryman came here in 1966, and he says in one of the dream songs, you know, I have moved to Dublin to have it out with you, majestic shade, you know, addressing Yeats. And it sounds very deliberate, as if he, you know, he only ever had Dublin in mind, but in fact, London was his first choice. It was just too expensive.
Thank you very much, Marianne, for those questions, and Philip for answering them so expertly. Are there any other questions or comments at this point? If not, I may have one that we can probably engage upon. I would like to, since I know, Philip, that you are not just an expert on Berryman, but also on other American authors in Ireland, and you just mentioned the appeal of Ireland to the American poets, and you've worked on Lowell as well. So what would you say, or can you say something about the appeal of Irish poetry, and especially of Ireland, Irish culture, the Irish history, to American poets, especially in the modernist era, but maybe also at other times, because it seems to be quite a strong transatlantic, there seems to be quite a strong transatlantic connection there.
Like, again, as I said earlier to Antonius, this is such a great question that there are many different answers that one could give. And I'll just touch on a few that come to mind. I mean, the first thing is that, and I'm sure you guys know this because you study Irish, Irish studies, but Ireland has felt for a very long time that it has a special relationship with the United States of America. And this is symbolized, of course, in the gift that the Irish Prime Minister, the Taoiseach, gives to the President of the United States every year on St. Patrick's Day. Again, I don't know if you know this, but they bring a bowl of shamrock, and they give it to the president. I don't know if it happened this year because of the pandemic, but anyway, this is what's done traditionally. So there's this sense of, a kind of a special relationship between Ireland and the United States. Of course, the United States probably would say that, well, they have a special relationship with every country, but we feel that we have a special relationship with them. But that transaction in itself and that kind of gift, I think, is really interesting. And it's the same thing, every year, the bowl of shamrock. And I do think that for many American poets, especially in the 20th century, and even to the present moment, this sense of a connection, a transatlantic connection, is very strong. Yeats is at the center of this, Ina, I think. Yeats, I think, and from very early in his career. And why is that the case? Well, because Yeats also fostered the American connection from very early on. His father fostered it before him. John Butler Yeats was already, he had a dealer in New York, John Quinn, who was selling his work there in the 1880s, the 1890s. And so the Yeats family, I think, were part of a group of Irish intellectuals at the end of the 19th century, including Oscar Wilde, which really kind of wanted to tap into whatever resources might be available on the other side of the Atlantic. And so it begins in a way in the 19th century. And you can see it also in the kind of Joyce industry and the way that Quinn and others sought then to buy up Joyce manuscripts, and this kind of obsession really with Irish writers. But it does work both ways. I have written about Berryman and Yeats, Berryman's obsession with Yeats. I've written about Lowell and Yeats, but also Lowell in relation to other Irish poets. And it is clear that, American poets in the 20th century identified Yeats as a central figure. I quoted Eliot in my lecture. Let's not forget that Eliot was an American poet, just happened to live in London for the last few decades of most of his life, indeed. Pound moving to London to learn from Yeats, how to write poetry. I mean, it's remarkable to acknowledge this. Yeats was seen as a central figure in the Anglophone world in poetry in the 20th century. There's no question about that. Part of it had to do with his attempt to reinvent himself, so many times, and also to write so effectively in so many different forms. When Yeats died in 1939, Berryman tried to assemble a group of contemporary American writers to write about Yeats's kind of career and his legacy. And it was published as a special issue of the Southern Review. People will be able to look it up online and find it. It's a remarkable kind of roll call of all the great some of the great American writers of the middle of the 20th century. And it continues, it continues through to the present time. I have, spoken with contemporary poets like, Timothy Donnelly, for example, but really, I think, interesting and significant contemporary poets for whom Yeats is still a really important figure. So again, I can't say precisely why. And the first part of my answer is slightly cynical in terms of like, well, there's money in it. And there are kind of political reasons behind it. And I think it's, it's good for certain interests to promote this relationship. But at the end of the day, the Yeats is still and I think remains a very central figure for many American poets, especially those writing within the kind of more formalist kind of traditions, I would say.
Yes, thanks very much, Philip.
What about in Germany, Ina, can I ask? I mean, do you think that German poets read Yeats, regard him highly, have any great interest? I mean, contemporary or even in the kind of, say, 1940s, 50s, 60s? I mean, I
wouldn't be the expert who answer that question, I'd say. I mean, I do know that in our, context at university, of course, Yeats is one prominent, or not, if not the prominent, of course, Irish poet. So I'd guess, for people interested in poetry, he would be, and English language poetry especially, he would be quite.
I think also if you think about let's say the kind of the critical establishment, and if I try to think about, who are the major US American critics of poetry in, say, the second half of the 19th century. And I think about people from R.P. Blackmer to Helen Vendler, or even, say, somebody as controversial as Harold Bloom. They all wrote books about Yeats. This is, I think, an interesting point. And that kind of, I referred earlier to the kind of critical hegemony of the new criticism. And for many, Yeats is often a kind of a central figure in terms of, when they look outside of the United States, it's to Yeats they look. It's not to Dylan Thomas or, Philip Larkin or these other poets. And I don't mean to specify English poets or a Welsh poet like Thomas, but Yeats does seem to be, as Eliot says, a great poet of his time.
Yeah. Miriam, maybe you can add this, because you're an expert on modernism. No, go ahead. What you just wrote in the chat.
Yeah, I just wrote in the chat, and I don't think of myself as necessarily an expert here, and I'm certainly not an expert on the technology, because I accidentally sent my chat comment first only to Ina. My only comment here would be my sense for the German poetic landscape is that it's particularly Eliot and Pound, due to really influential translations by Eva Hesse. This might be a question for Herr Achilles. It would seem to me that those two writers are the benchmark poets and writers due to these really important translations. I do not believe that Eva Hesse translated Yeats, but I might be wrong. I might be wrong.
Okay, yes, thank you very much. Herr Achilles.
Oh, there's Jochen. Hello, Jochen. Apologies for the familiarity, everybody. I've met Jochen before, and it's just lovely to see him.
Yeah, it's lovely to see you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, well, maybe a remark to the centrality of Yeats. Yeats was also, and I think because of his widespread mythology he self-created, in a sense, also extremely central to Irish studies in Ireland and to international Irish studies. I went to the ISWÜ conferences first in the late 70s, and the majority of papers was on Yeats and when the moon wandered in the seventh house and what that meant and so forth and on. And that was treated like almost like a religion. And of course, thankfully, the picture has diversified a lot since then. And I would also have a little question, again, not the big picture, and because we've lost the cats out of sight, sort of thing, a bit in the course of the discussion. And you mentioned critical animal studies and human animal studies. Of course, there are these the companion species manifesto and transhumanist approaches to view animals as indeed companions. And from that angle, I think I don't know, and this is the question, is the impression true that most of the time cats here play a role as images of self-aggrandizement, you know, I'm the cat, or the question of the choice between life and work is addressed via cats, and also Pound as a feeder of cats, also as a supporter of and an enabler of artists. Cats play a metaphorical or metonymical role. And you ended up saying, quoting Berryman, "It is wonderful how cats bound about." I mean, this kind of attitude seems to be very rare. I thought the one example is Yeats's The Meditation of the Old Fisherman, in which he really seems to try to capture the movement of cats via another comparison with the movement of the waves. But the major interest is in cats as such, as cats. And would you say this is rare, and the anthropomorphic interest in, you know, that the most important thing about the cat is that it was Maud Gonne's cat, you know, for Yeats. That this is predominant, you know, using, if you like, instrument for human uses, instead of trying to see them as phenomena in themselves.
This is a really, I think, really important set of observations, Jochen. I mean, the first thing to say, when you mentioned Yeats' centrality to Irish studies, and this was partly why I took the challenge of writing on Yeats and cats, because you're quite right. There was a sense in which the phrase Yeats and ...
Yeah.
Just everything has been done. Yeats and magic, Yeats and myth, Yeats. So, well, what about Yeats and cats? So that was partly, you're quite right. There was partly because of that sense of, of a field having been exhausted. But of course, with a great writer, that never happens. There's always something more to be said. And this is why also, as I started to think about this talk, and indeed I'll be thinking about it a lot more as we go forward, I think that there is a lot more to something, even something as apparently, I won't say trivial, but it's a minor detail. As I said, if you look at the concordance to Yeats's poems, there are very few references, but when they occur, they are very significant and very powerful. And the examples I selected were those of Black Minaluche, and then I talked also about that kind of image of the man, half beast, the lion figure in the Second Coming, which is probably one of Yeats's most well-known images. So then, this kind of relates to the second part of your question, Jochen. Why do they attempt to, why do Yeats and Berryman kind of attempt to, why do they represent, why do they seize upon these images, and indeed, why do they appropriate them? And I think actually for Berryman, the appropriation of cats, I mean, the image of Henry Pussycat, is not unrelated to the question of race, which Marianne brought up. I think Berryman has a very clear sense that when you talk about somebody as a cat, a fast cat, you're doing so in the way that you would refer to, as I said, from the OED, a kind of a jazz musician. I think that's absolutely clear. Yeats doesn't have that sense of it. I mean, for Yeats, this idea of the king of the cats comes out of folklore. It's something that Swinburne is supposed to have said. I don't think Yeats has that idea in it, but both of them in different ways. If we were to move it into the sphere of kind of critical animal studies, both of them are appropriating these kind of, the imagery of another species for purely anthropomorphic ends. I mean, purely human desires, purely human needs, indeed, are being addressed and met here, I think. So it's, even though it is a minor figure in a way in Yeats, I think it is consequential. I think it does speak to us about, the way in which Yeats viewed the animal world and how he used the animal world in the making of his poetry, but more importantly, in terms of how he sought to remake himself. Because Yeats, of course, talked about this, the importance of self-reinvention. And I think a longer study would, tease this out and look at the ways in which Yeats often tries to, and indeed, think about something like, the circus animals' desertion, or, sailing to Byzantium, which is, I think, the best example. How often Yeats tries to flee the human, in fact, to not be human. So it's a kind of a start. But as I say, in Berryman's case, it's very tricky, because on the one hand, he seems to be creating this kind of identification with the black figure, but of course it isn't identification at all. I mean, it's pure appropriation. It's merely putting on a mask. And perhaps he felt on some level that the term, the cat figure was a kind of a kind of an evasion of this, but I think eventually, as you read through the Dream Songs, you see that he realizes that it exhausts itself, that it actually doesn't succeed. So I think, I don't know if that answers the question really, Jochen. To be honest with you, I don't think it does, because I think these are questions that need a lot more careful consideration, for sure.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, Achilles, for bringing us back to cats and rounding off this lunchtime talk, we might say, about Yeats and Berryman and cats.
May I, sorry to interrupt you. The last slide, which I have taken down, but I will just mention so that people can check it out, is a painting. You can find it online by Jack B. Yates, called The Cat Among the Stars. So you can find it online, The Cat Among the Stars by Jack B. Yates from 1939. It is a picture of a figure kind of reclining, and there's an enormous black cat over them. And in a way, it's that kind of overwhelming, the way in which the figure begins to overwhelm the poet and the subject. That's kind of where we're going with this. Sorry, thank you.
Yes, thanks very much. That's a very good image for what we've been talking about for the last roughly 90 minutes. So thank you again, Philip, for being with us today virtually, sharing your thoughts on the two poets and the images and of the cats and their uses, and especially for taking the time to answer people's questions. So thank you everyone else for joining us today, for your interest in this guest lecture. And I'd like to say goodbye and ask the people from the Irish Studies and the American Studies teams and the colleagues to maybe stay on for a quick chat afterwards. Everyone else, thank you very much for your interest. Hoping to see you again, maybe for our workshop, Environmental Humanities and Irish Studies. And then we do have another guest lecture in the middle about Irish cinema. So check out our website for further information. Thank you very much for your interest. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Ina. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.